Good morning, everybody. Merry Christmas. All right. Well, one of our Christmas traditions growing up is that my parents would take me and my brother to cut down a Christmas tree every year. And we'd gather up all of our snow gear, we'd meet our cousins, and then we'd head down the country roads to a tree farm in the backwoods of Wisconsin. We'd find the perfect Christmas tree, and we would drink scalding hot cocoa from the farm as they netted up our prized tree for transport. And then we would all head to the dugout bar. Yes, my parents took us to a bar for lunch. For bottles of root beer and lunch next to the fireplace, and it was filled with fried cheese curds and laughter. Eventually, our tree would make its way home, usually with a story to tell. In our own traditions, whether we realize it or not, I would love for you to think about why you love them so much. When you cut through it, I love those Christmas tree cutting days not because of how great I looked in hat hair, or we had to freeze until my dad found the perfectly symmetrical spruce, or because the bar held so much Christmas spirit. It was because we were together as a family, and we could have been anywhere those holidays. We need to allow ourselves the space to be reminded of what Christmas and these Christmas traditions are all about. Our hope is over the next 2 weeks, we can cut through all the gift wrap, the unending lists, and these heightened emotions and get down to the fact that not only in this season, Jesus is everywhere we go, always, and he is at the core of it. The story of his birth, this ancient Christmas, is imperative to our faith, but this just wasn't a fun Christmas tale that God added in the Bible because he wanted another holiday. It was God's plan. It was set into motion all the way back in the beginning. Jesus and this themes of a great Redeemer coming for his people are talked about all over the Bible and not just in the New Testament. So throughout the next 2 weeks, we're going to trace how these prophecies of the Old Testament came into fulfillment hundreds of years later in Jesus' birth, and they even continued throughout his life, and what that means for us. Jesus' birth was not a Plan B situation. This ancient Christmas was placed right where God meant it to be. And what I'm trying to do here is probably could cover a 10-week series, but we're just going to scratch the surface and hit some of the major points in the next 2 weeks. And we're going to focus our intentions on the King of Kings. Now, I realize the idea of prophecy can sound kind of out there and can give us a hesitant approach. Prophecy can be hard for us to grasp because we live in a world where media, major corporations, or even people like your Aunt Marge, after a couple cups of eggnog, she starts telling the future. But all of these things are telling us half-truths, that they never become really fulfilled. True prophecy simply means this: it's a prediction or a promise from God of something that will happen in the future. There are multiple prophets God used in the Bible, and today we are lucky enough that we can see the Bible as a whole. Many folks of the Bible times, they didn't get to see things come to fruition or understand fulfillment, which is the achievement of something promised. The amount of prophecy fulfilled in the Bible is astounding, and if we just look at the prophecies surrounding Jesus' life, the scientific probability, and if we just took 8 of them, that any one person could fulfill those 8 prophecies is 1 in 10 to the 17th power. And Jesus, he not only fulfilled 8, he fulfilled 48 prophecies that were all written 3 centuries before he was even born into this world. When I hear that, I want to know what these prophecies were all about. We know that God, he used Mary, Jesus, his mom, as an intricate part of his story. So 740 years prior The prophet Isaiah was already explaining God's plan and how he was going to use this young girl. There was a king on Jerusalem's throne. His name was Ahaz, and the prophet Isaiah was trying to relay God's message to him. Isaiah said, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel." Isaiah is letting the king know that God himself, not another messenger, will be sending a sign, a child that literally means Emmanuel, God with us. But notice that Isaiah does not give a timetable of this situation. We are on God's timing, not ours. The Lord is asking an earthly king to put a trust in God to see this through. King Ahaz, if I could describe him in Christmas terms, he was a real Grinch, okay? And probably, like us, he decided to ignore Isaiah's advice. And he chose to do things on his own terms. Does that sound like anyone you know? God needed a vessel, someone who could fulfill what God told Isaiah long ago. He could have sent Jesus to earth like Superman in that giant asteroid, and then it just hit the earth, and the Jerusalem press and the Inquirer would have been there. It would have been this whole thing. But he chose not to do that. Instead, his way was much more perfect. It was humbly into this world that Jesus came. And here's where the story comes into fruition 700 years later, written for us in the book of Luke. So God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary, and the angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored, the Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered, what kind of greeting might this be? But the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, you have found favor with God." So just imagine, you are going about your morning, you gather your things, your coffee and your coat, and you're headed out the door, and out of nowhere, a heavenly messenger just shows up. And I'm sure she was frightened because in other translations of the Bible, he just appears out of nowhere. But he assures her that God is with her. And he went on to say, "You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High. His kingdom, it will never end." Now, I'm sure her thoughts were racing, and she was in a little bit of shock. Mary was 14 years old, engaged to Joseph. Culturally, this marriage was arranged. This was normal of that time period, and they barely spent time alone together. And I'm sure she's trying to make sense of how, among all the women on earth, she was the one chosen to bear the Son of God. And thinking, what are the people of Nazareth going to say? And how is she going to explain this to her soon-to-be husband? This is a pretty quick summation, but we finally get to see the fulfillment from what Isaiah told us. The virgin's name was Mary. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. Gabriel ends his time with, "For no word from God will ever fail." Something amazing was happening in Mary's heart in that moment, because Mary answers, "I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled." I'm sure this interaction happened in just a few moments, but this encounter set Mary's life on a completely new trajectory. From this text, we can see a few things that we can learn from this prophecy. A secret ambition that I'm going to share today, and I'm confident will never be fulfilled in my lifetime, is to be a trapeze artist. I have zero upper body strength, so I just choose to imagine that. But you've all seen those kinds of acts, maybe at the circus or Cirque du Soleil, where one partner gains speed on their trapeze, and at some point, they have to choose to let go. They soar through the air, and the catcher's job is to grab them at the exact moment before gravity takes place. It seems so effortless and strong, and it really, really represents our lives when we think of God's timing. We are swinging back and forth, and at some point, we have to choose to give up control and let go of what is comfortable and easy. When we choose to release that grasp on the trapeze, it's then up to our partner knowing the perfect time to grab us. It's God's job to catch us. If all of his prophecies are fulfilled and he believes that we are his child, don't you think it's his number one job to catch us? It's hard for us to live in God's exact and perfect timing because it feels like we sure can get it done a lot faster. Or we can visualize how it can be accomplished much better. But isn't it tiring to be in the struggle of control? So I encourage you to pick an area of your life and release that back to him. Maybe that's your finances, a relationship, the job that we have dreamed of, health circumstances, anxiety, having the perfect Christmas, expectations of our loved ones. It's hard to realize, but when we do that, we are able to see the growth and the beauty that comes, what we believe is impossible, become possible with God. The timing of God's fulfillment was a long way off from Isaiah's prophecy when it was originally told to King Ahaz. But it's not because God just forgot about it. There are reasons why his timing makes sense way more than ours. There's things that had to happen in certain times and certain places, and he knew that. Mary probably didn't appreciate the sudden pregnancy with her engagement, or listening to all the hush whispers as she walked through town, or riding a donkey all the way to Bethlehem when she felt like a bloated donkey herself. But she chose to let go of that trapeze. And she said to Gabriel that day, "May your word be fulfilled." I'm sure there were questions and wondering how the heck this was going to work out. But she had the confidence of realizing that God was going to catch her in the end. And he's going to catch you too. God chose Mary long ago, and if he noticed Mary, he surely notices us. He wants us to use our life for him, but sometimes we get caught up with the list of qualifications that come into our thoughts. I'm not good enough. My life doesn't look any better than it did last month. My past is too much for my future. How am I ever qualified to live my life for him? My friend and I have talked about this idea many times, how we tell ourselves these stories, these narratives that keep rolling around in our head. And, you think about it like, what was it that one person said? Or what were they thinking in that moment? Why didn't they text me back immediately? It was probably something I did. Or did I? And that narrative, it just starts to consume our thoughts and make us feel like we will never be qualified in his eyes. Mary was a 14-year-old girl who found favor with God, but like anyone, we are all human. And now God is asking her to birth the Son of God, a tremendous weight on her shoulders in this moment, but also what is to come. This is not going to be a fancy-free life ahead of her. I'm sure she was thinking, am I going to be the perfect mom to the Son of God? Do I break off my engagement because I'm pregnant? And who in the world is going to believe this? And if Mary's story isn't enough for you to tackle, think about all the people God used in his birth story. The innkeeper, just a hospitality worker that was overwhelmed with weekend guests. But yet, he was still able to have compassion enough to allow them to use this lowly manger for the night. The shepherds, they had little to no status in the world. Their social equivalent was that of a tax collector. And they were just a ragtag bunch of guys just getting ready to settle out in the fields for the night. But they were the first to hear from the heavenly messengers that the ultimate shepherd of his people had been born. And Joseph, Mary's fiancé, who was the town carpenter, he had meager means. He was tasked with fathering the Son of God. By the world's standards, are any of these people qualified to be part of the birth of Christ, the King's entrance into the world? No, not at all. But it's because in God's eyes, we are qualified through him. We get to live out the gospel, or other words, good news of what Jesus is all about because of him. God's going to use us. We are not perfect. I can give you a list of every reason I have jacked it up as a wife, a mom, a friend, as a Christian since last Sunday. I'm not going to give you that list today. But because of his grace, God is going to use me because in his eyes I am qualified, and he believes the same about you, that you are qualified through him too. After Mary's time with Gabriel, she says, "For though I am God's humble servant, God has noticed me." Yes, he's noticed you. So if this is how he feels about you and you catch yourself feeling unqualified, here are a couple ideas I came up with just to help them flesh them out, and I've used some of these as well. It's a process of training our brain to listen to his words, not what the devil wants for you to believe. Replacing those thoughts with some verses or others that you find reading his words. Some examples would be, when you feel afraid and anxious, God tells you, you are not ruled by fear. When you feel overwhelmed and chained down by your past, God says, you are free in Christ. When you feel unlovable and not seen, God says, you are chosen and loved. He notices you because before you were ever born, he formed you in the womb and he knew you. Another option would be confiding in a trusted friend, and this can shine a light on the situation and bring support. Somebody that can point you to God's truth. And finally, instead of writing out that Christmas to-do list today, I'd love for you to write out what you feel is in your heart, the lies, the hurt, the shame, the thoughts that are rolling around in your head, and how you believe you're not qualified. When it's all out there, I want you to fold it up and throw it away, maybe toss it in the fireplace. It's that physical act for you to allow those ideas to leave your heart and know that God, he was never holding on to that list to begin with. When we have the knowledge of being known and qualified through him, we have the freedom to continue to grow. One other line that stood out to me when we were reading was Gabriel said, "For no word from God will ever fail." Isn't that line comforting? No word from God will ever fail. Because of our human nature, we think about all the people who have broken our promises, disregarded our hearts. Maybe they're going to be at your Christmas dinner. But nothing that God will ever say will fail. God stuck to his promise in Jesus, and his word never falters. And the good news is God will never fail us. Even all the way in the beginning of the Bible, when Eve ate of the forbidden fruit, God was hinting at a promise of a coming Redeemer. I recently saw this illustration from Sister Grace Remington. She's in Dubuque, Iowa. And the first thing I think about when I see this is Eve. She looks so miserable in her sin. And maybe you feel like that sometimes. You're just miserable. But then Mary, pregnant with Jesus, she's able to comfort her because she knows that the fulfillment is coming. And you can see that horrible serpent just binding herself around Eve's leg. That sin that's holding her back. However, through Mary, she smashes it below her feet. In Genesis 3:1-5, all the way at the beginning of the Bible, God says to the serpent, the devil, "From now on, you and the woman will be enemies, as will your offspring and hers. You will strike his heel, but he will crush your head." It is the first promise of God saying he will not fail us. He is sending Jesus, our Redeemer, who will crush the head of the serpent, our sin. And it is yet another prophecy that is fulfilled through Jesus. I know we've gone through a lot this morning, but I hope that you are starting to see the wonder of this first ancient Christmas and how God's plan is impeccably piecing itself together for you. The timing of how life happens is never going to be on our terms. But maybe that's for the best. Allow him to be king over your life. And when fears of being unqualified rears its ugly head and whispers to us, utilize those exercises to release them from your mind and hear what God has to say about you. His promises for us are true, and he will not fail you. 2 Corinthians 1:20 says, whatever God has promised gets stamped with the yes of Jesus. Yes, we can trust in God's timing, and he will hold us together. Yes, we are qualified through him. Yes, God knows you, and he sees you. Yes, his promises are true, and they were fulfilled. And yes, Jesus was born on that ancient Christmas, and he will forever be our great Redeemer.